Hello, folks, and welcome back to World War II TV. And we are nearly through Jungles Week on this channel this week, so that's kind of flown by. We've got one more show coming up on Friday where Daniel Burke is talking about his grandfather who was with the Chindits and ended up being captured by the Japanese, and his new book on that subject is coming out soon, so that'll be a good one to look forward to. But today we are off to New Guinea. You may remember earlier in the year we had Carl James on talking about Kokoda, and we had John McManus on talking about the Battle of Abuna. Well, this is later in the campaign when the Allies are on the offensive. And yesterday, if you were with me last night, we had Robert Lyman on, and Robert Lyman, you know, is one of the premier British historians about the Far East. Well, today we have one of Australia's premier historians about the Far East, Phillip Bradley. I'm really pleased to have him with us because he's a prolific author and writes in that way that just makes these battles come alive, which is all you ever require as a historian. So, good evening to you, Philip, where you are. Morning for me. How are you doing?
Good, mate. How are you?
I'm pretty well. Apart my cold is just about gone now. So I was just saying there in the introduction there, your book on Shaggy Ridge is one of the books I really enjoyed reading. I mean, I read lots and lots for the channel, and you know, but that one, your one, stayed with me because you have that engaging style of making the history come alive. And before we get into your presentation, one of the other things that I want you to kind of touch on at the beginning is you're not solely using Australian sources, you are using Japanese sources, which when it comes to Pacific is harder to do because of language for a start and access to archives. But why was it important for you to have both sides reflected in this battle?
Sort of coming back from my previous book, D-Day New Guinea, where I really wanted to find out about the Japanese, what happened to them in the battle for Lae in 1943, and so I approached some Japanese guys I had contact with and managed to get some translations of some Japanese material, paid for a bit as well, and got their story, which is a totally new story to it. And so I carried this over into my new book, Battle for Shaggy Ridge, where I was lucky enough to have 3 Japanese veterans who were on the ridge. I had their accounts of the battle. One had to be translated. One was through an interview through a friend who who taught in Japan 20 odd years ago. And it was quite extraordinary that we had 3 accounts of Japanese veterans who were up on the ridge because very few of them survived. So I wanted their stories into the book because it just gave a different perspective on it. And also I just got smarter at using some of the internet resources, particularly the US Army monographs, which were produced after the war. And a lot of those have now been digitized. So I did a lot of work with those. And the Australian War Memorial is very good. They've translated a number of Japanese books by 2 Japanese staff officers who served with the 18th Army in New Guinea. So both of those are very interesting, and I've used them in a number of my books. So yeah, it's and it just brings a whole new perspective to the book.
Well, absolutely. And it's, you know, there are some classic books we all can think of that tell the story of an allied unit throughout a complete campaign or a complete war. And as brilliant as they are, sometimes the enemy are just there as to make up the numbers. They're like kind of stormtroopers in Star Wars films. No one never explains who the units are, what they were doing, what their motivations were, what their battle plans were. It's all told from the Allied point of view. But for me, I do like to get those both perspectives because it's easier for us to understand the greater battle if we have the context of what the enemy are thinking as well. But anyway, so you've provided us a fantastic PowerPoint presentation. So we're talking about the battle for Shaggy Ridge. Let's talk about where we are and which campaign we're talking about, because during the course of Jungles Week on the channel, we have been on the defensive stage. Well, our first show about Guadalcanal and John Basilone was really a defensive position. The Marines were defending Henderson Field. Then Robert Lyman yesterday was talking about kind of a rescue operation, but now with New Guinea in the late 1942, early 1943, 43, 44, we're talking about the offensive aspect now. So let's explain where we are, Philip.
Okay, well, let's go back a little bit to the Kokoda campaign, and if you can point to the Kokoda trail area, Kokoda track. There we are. So that's down in the southern part of New Guinea, if you like. So what we call Papua, Papuan side. And so that campaign on the Kokoda track through to the beachheads at Buna and Gona, that didn't finish till basically February 1943. And basically the Australian 7th Division, which took part in that battle, was spent after that battle. So they had to be rebuilt. They were rebuilt back in Queensland, in Australia. And then also the Allied, particularly the US Air Force and the US Navy, had to build up the resources to land amphibious troops up at Lae to attack Lae. So this didn't take place till September 1943. So when the capture of Lae took place, it took place from landings at sea, from the ocean, and then also from the air. So Lae was captured within 2 weeks, and then following that battle, the Australians moved east towards Finschhafen at the end of the Yuan Gulf. You can see Finschhafen to the right of Lae, to the east, and then they moved up the valley, up the Markham and Ramu valleys to Dumpu, and then Shaggy Ridge is just north of there. So that's the area we're talking about. So we're talking about reaching that area in October 1943, and then the battle for Shaggy Ridge actually continued right through to the end of January 1944. So it was quite a protracted campaign, and a lot of it was there were other things taking place at the same time. For example, at the end of 1943, the Americans landed on New Britain. As I said, the Australians had landed at Finschhafen on one side of the Vitiaz Strait, and the Americans landed on the other side in December, and then on the north side of New Guinea in January 1944. So essentially the battle took place for the control of the Ramu Valley and the airfield sites. This is a very flat area of New Guinea, as you'll see in the next slide. So you can see here where Shaggy Ridge is, and you see that valley to the south of Shaggy Ridge between the highlands of New Guinea and the Finisterre Range. And that was an excellent airfield site. So the Americans put in airfields there from which they could then strike the Japanese bases further up the coast, particularly at Hollandia. And that preceded the attack on Hollandia. And then from there, the Americans could head on to the Philippines, which was MacArthur's objective all the time. So Shaggy Ridge basically was the main Japanese defensive position in that area. And that's what the fighting revolved around.
And over the years, you know, being Australian, and that we talked with Carl James earlier in the year about the Kokoda track, and has it meant to some extent that because of the fame of the Kokoda track, what happened in the months that followed has sort of been relegated to the second part of history, because the Kokoda reputation, the mystique, the mythology about that has superseded everything in that it's become, you know, Gallipoli, First World War, Kokoda, Second World War. So your average Australian, if you bumped into them on the street of Melbourne or Sydney and you mentioned Kokoda, they would have a frame of reference. But if you said Shaggy Ridge, would that mean anything to most Australians, apart from those who've read your book, of course?
Well, not to this generation, but certainly, for example, my father's generation would know of it because it was quite famous at the time. But that's a long time ago now. It's, well, coming up 80 years ago. So hopefully my books can change that a little bit, because I think the Australian contribution to the battles in the Second World War in this area were very important. And these were victories. It's a bit like comparing the Amiens offensive of 1918 to the Gallipoli. You know, Amiens 1918 was an extremely effective campaign compared to the early Gallipoli campaign. It was a success, and so was Shaggy Ridge.
Well, super stuff. So we'll move through. So let's talk about terrain, because one of the things that's been a takeaway I'm taking away myself from this week is that jungle isn't just jungle. I mean, I'm calling this week Jungle's Week, but there's very different types of jungle. Even within the same landmass, there are different types of jungle. We learned yesterday from Ross Cable in Malaya about one type of kind of terrain there. Then Robert Lyman talked about the high mountains towards the Himalayas in the north of Burma and India, a very different type of jungle. So for those who are watching this, who've never been to this part of the world at all, who don't understand New Guinea, don't have any kind of visual idea of what it's like there, and you've been there yourself on battlefield tours, you've been there researching. So what type of jungle are we talking about? And indeed, is it more than one type of jungle?
Yeah, I tend to talk of, when I talk about New Guinea, I talk of terrain warfare, because you're not just talking of jungle, you're talking of terrain. And Shaggy Ridge is a great example of that. Now, in this photo is an aerial photo of Shaggy Ridge taken from the north, looking along the ridge. The ridge is 10 kilometres long, and you can see it falls away on either side, and it falls away at about 45-degree angle down to the valley. So it's 1,400 metres high, and the area where it falls away to along the rivers on the side of it, 800 meters, 600 meters high. So it actually rises 800 meters within that short distance. So it's incredibly high and steep and dominating. And so, and they called it the one-man front because even though the Australians had a couple of brigades of troops up there and the Japanese had only, at the end, only a couple of companies defending it, they could hold it because basically the main attack had to come somehow along the ridge or up the side of the ridge. So when we're talking here of jungle warfare, Shaggy Ridge is very interesting because on one side, on the left side, as you're looking at it there, it's very open, kunai grass, and on the other side, it's very, very thick, steep jungle. And that's because of the way the clouds come in from the ocean, which is to the right of the photo. Yeah.
And that's a good point, because when we talk about fighting in the jungle, neither side is actually fighting for the jungle. They're fighting either for bits of high ground or transportation hubs or harbors or airfields or whatever. No one needs the jungle. It's all a means to an end. When we talk about Burma, we're talking about the limited transport routes through it. We're talking about, with Ross, yes, the Himalaya. We're talking about bridges and roads through the Malayan Peninsula. So in this area, it's about this ridge of high ground. And as you said there, if you get the right bit of high ground, as we know from history, a small number of defenders can make life very, very difficult for even a larger number of attackers if they have the high ground. That is one of those
exactly, and that was pretty much the way throughout New Guinea. Throughout New Guinea campaigns, it was like that. Now the jungle had other effects, one of which is disease. There's a lot of disease in New Guinea, malaria, particularly in this area. So fighting in the jungle, everything is wet, so it rains every day up there. So things rot. You have a limited time you can leave troops in the front line in that area until they really just start wasting away. So you've got that effect. You've also got the effect of the jungle as camouflage. For the Japanese had mountain guns at the northern end, the nearest end of the ridge, which fired on the Australians, and the Australians had a hell of a time, even though they had air power and air superiority, trying to spot these guns and fire at them. So the jungle could be a benefit if you used it the right way.
And and we'll get back to the presentation in a second, but this is the feature of the 43, 44 era, and even later, the Japanese have learnt how to defend each of these various islands they're holding out on in different ways. There's no standard practice they're employing because it depends on the nature. We think about Iwo Jima later in the campaign, a very different type of terrain to New Guinea, but the Japanese are kind of masters of holding an area with a limited amount of people by using the terrain, using the natural environment to their advantage, and essentially channeling the Allies up into the areas they want them to go, the approach roads and the approach paths. So we'll move along, and this when you sent me this is just a very, very effective way of conveying the starkness and the steep sides of this ridge, because there's I'm a Normandy guy, Philip, as you know. Sometimes I take people who have been reading about a ridge for years and years, and they go there and it's a slightly kind of gentle sided bump, and they go, this isn't a ridge. But it is a ridge. It's just like the Boogie Boost Ridge for Operation Goodwood.
Sure.
It's not a ridge. It is a ridge, but this is a ridge. This is like to me, as soon as I saw the photos, it's like the back of a dinosaur. This is like a stegosaurus, isn't it? This is a serious ridge.
In my first book, I actually called it like a fallen dinosaur with the bones sticking out, and that's exactly what it's like. So this is a view from that western side where the rainforest is very thick. And this is the main highest points of the ridge, which most of the battles were fought over, what they call the pimples. And so you can see here just how sharp and dominating they were and how difficult that fighting would be. And I think that was the attraction in writing the book. One was my father served up there, but the second one was just how the hell do you fight a battle in these sort of areas.
And it brings us back this whole principle of visiting the sites that you write about. It's come up so many times. Robert Lyman, yes, he has been to Burma and Myanmar very many times to investigate it, and to fully understand terrain, you've got to put your boots on the ground to walk the same paths these people did. And in your case, your father was there as well. And so, that I have to say, folks, that does come through in Philip's writing. So the links to Philip's book are in the description below. You can follow him on Twitter as well. But it's one of those books that it doesn't just tell you the events. It takes you to the location so that you feel you're there, walking alongside these guys. Your visual description of the area is really to your credit, Philip. If you will take that compliment from me.
Yeah, thanks.
So there's another photo. It's just an amazing photo. I mean, look at that ridge. That is, folks, that is, like you see there, this kind of dinosaur metaphor we've both used there. So, I mean, yeah, we'll have other photos later on. But so I'll hand back to
again,
you.
That's the main pimples. And there you can see in the background the Ramu Valley and how flat the Ramu Valley is. The advantage of that was the Australians had an airfield there, so all the supplies for basically the two brigades that operated in that area, that's 6 battalions of men, actually 7 battalions of men with a pioneer battalion, they could be supplied from the air. And that was the advantage the Australians had. All the Japanese supplies had to come, if they could get supplies because of what was happening in the submarine warfare, all the supplies had to come in on the backs of men.
And talking about the naval battle, folks, we have got Michael Veitch coming up in November on Australia at War Week, talking about the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, which is the body of water close to New Guinea, which is his latest book, talking about that aspect of it. So the score, folks. These shows all kind of connect together in this spider's web of information. That's what we're trying to achieve here. And Philip is going to come back in Australia Week as well and expand on his presentation. So well, that's the terrain sorted. So let's and that other great photo there. I mean, it's like each photo is building it up even more and more amazing what this terrain is like. And it's just
this was interesting because I went to the Shaggy Ridge. The last time I went was 2 years ago with an Australian Army officers group. We took Australian Army officers to the base of the ridge. We didn't have time to go up there, but that was taken with a drone, and the drone gives you a really good perspective that you can't get from the ground. So you can just see there how dominating. So that's the southern shoulder, and that's the way the Australians advanced up the ridge to the which you can see the pimple up the top there, which was the Japanese position. So that's what we're talking about when they come up, when they attack up. As Dean Murphy says, it was a one-man front.
Yeah, and it's always good for these shows to get the terrain sorted out and the location right at the beginning, because now we can layer on the human stories and the actual account itself. But I think people now have a complete understanding of just what a bitch of a terrain this is. And I can't imagine what it'd be like as an Australian infantryman somewhere at the bottom in that valley there, looking up at that and being told, at some point you've got to work your way up there and dislodge the enemy up there. It would be, there's lots of impossible actions or seemingly impossible actions in World War II, but that one you're going to have to be shaking your head and thinking, my God, yeah. So there we are. So I'll hand back to you.
Okay, so the photo on the left is a photo that led me to this Shaggy Ridge. This is a photo of my father. He's fourth in line, moving up the southern slope of Shaggy Ridge. So that's with his company commander is second in line, and they were climbing Shaggy Ridge. So during the war, there was a book put out with all the wartime photos in it, and my father annotated this one to his sister at the time, and had a little note on the back which said all about how he climbed this ridge. And so I'd seen that since I was a kid. My father died when I was very young, so I'd always wanted to go to that spot. And I was fortunate enough to get a job in New Guinea back in 1995. I was worked there for 2 years at Lae, which is down the valley. So one of my first objectives was to go up to Shaggy Ridge. So I actually climbed Shaggy Ridge on New Year's Day, 1996, and went in, basically followed my father's footsteps. So the photo on the right is a map, and this shows the first main attack on Shaggy Ridge, which to capture the pimple. This was carried out by the 2nd 16th Battalion, which was another battalion that was up there in this 21st Brigade. And you can see how narrow the top of the ridge is in that sort of map. And basically the troops came up from one end, and after a very heavy bombardment. Now I want to talk a little bit about the bombardment. Just gives you some idea of the support the Australians had. So 1,750 rounds of 25-pounder ammunition were fired on that position over about an hour. And basically I worked it out, for each Japanese soldier who was up there, they probably got 50 rounds of 25-pounder ammunition fired at them each. Plus there were 16 Kitty Hawk bombers which bombed the top of the ridge. So they might have had a dozen casualties, but but that was the preliminary to the attack.
Good grief! I
You
mean,
can see the attack.
That's an
Yeah.
astonishing artillery barrage, isn't it? I mean, 750 rounds, 1,750 rounds from 25-pounders at one.
Yeah,
one
all the
like
guns
that.
were down in the valley, so they'd fire up onto the ridge from down near the valley. Yeah, but yeah, it's an extraordinary amount of support. And the trouble was, it made the approach to the ridge for the men attacking, because it was very steep at that point. To get up, all the rock had been shattered, and they had a lot of trouble getting footholds and such. But they managed to take those positions. Yeah. So this is one of the soldiers watching the bombardment. So he's looking towards the Pimple, which is in the distance there, above his. Yeah, that's it up there, and it's been bombarded, and then the troops went in along the top. So this is a view from the first Japanese position, looking back along the ridge from the direction the Australians came, and it's very steep here. The Australians came in. One guy got over the top, and he was having a duel with a grenade duel with the guys in the bunker, and then another guy came around one side, but all the trees had been blasted, so it was really hard to make any progress. And then a guy came in from the left-hand side there and took the position, went in with a grenade and own gun and took the position. He was awarded a Distinguished Conduct Medal, although he was wounded in the attack.
Wow. Ernest Malley, who's always watching us, is talking about the unit here, and he's saying possibly the roughest unit in the Australian infantry force, a lot of miners. So yeah, for those who don't understand the makeup of an Australian infantry unit, what is that typical of a unit at this time of the war in 1943? Tough kind of outdoors guys? Because, you know, we think about that for some of the Canadian troops in Normandy, for example, as being lots of fishermen and lumberjacks and forestry people, and it isn't. It's true to some extent. The British Army by 1944 is kind of all the farmers and the outdoor guys have been called up 2 years earlier. So what would be kind of average Australian unit at this time of the war? Is it lots of miners and farmers and outdoor people?
It depends on where it came from. Certainly the original 2nd 16th was all West Australians, and they had what they called a Kalgoorlie company to all miners and tough guys, and I knew a few of them, but some of them were from different areas. But the trouble was, during the Kokoda and Buna and campaigns at Gona, they had lost so many men that they had to be completely rebuilt. So a lot of the men I talked to for the battle, they came from New South Wales. They came from the Hunter Valley. They were also, a lot of them were miners in the Hunter Valley and farmers, and they were tough guys too. But they'd been in a motorised regiment, which they didn't need anymore to defend Australia, because they knew the Japanese weren't going to invade Australia by that time. So they traded in their motorised, their trucks, and they became infantry. So they came from the 16th Motor Regiment, went into the 2nd 16th Battalion. It was simple as that. But half the men up there were from New South Wales, so it was completely different. But again, great soldiers. They just had a great attitude, and they were very well trained, and they were well equipped. And I think that was the big difference. And most of them came from the same areas. They kept them together, a little bit like the British PALS battalions. They kept them together, so they fought for each other. Yeah.
And how long have they been in theatre? You talked about the landings. I mean, have they had time to acclimatise? Just because you were talking about the risk of disease, the climate there, had they been there for some time to get used to it?
Yeah, they'd flown in September 1943, and they'd marched up the valley. They'd all got malaria, and the malaria, more of them got malaria as time went on. So by December, this was the final. The book tells it well, because they were actually just told to hold the position, not even to attack. But they said they could attack and they could take the position, which they did. But soon after this attack, they were relieved by another brigade, because their wastage factor from malaria had risen to over 5%. So and it kept rising. So they were replaced by another brigade, which we'll talk about later. Now that's a view today from the same position, and you can see, I mean, the ridge doesn't change, and you'll go up there in 1,000 years and it won't have changed. When I went up in 1995, actually, there were still the foxholes there, still had, Bren gun cartridges still lying around the edges of them, as if they'd been fired yesterday. So very few people go up there. They now do some odd tour up there. So I recommend it if you ever get a chance to go up there, not just for the military history, but just for the sheer spectacularness of walking along that ridge. It's a very special experience. Yeah.
And we get a good idea of the terrain there on the top of the ridge.
Totally.
There, not thick jungle. It's more like a forest in some ways, of space
Yeah,
between
it
the
is.
trees,
It's very steep as well. Yeah, and you can see the valley in the background and how open that is. These are two of the guys who took the Pimple. On the left is Tom McMahon. They called him Pinky McMahon. He'd won a military medal at Gona. Really tough platoon sergeant. And they just had a new lieutenant take over the platoon. He told the lieutenant, "Don't worry about this attack. I'll sort it out." And he did. So he was an experienced soldier. He'd fought in the Middle East as well. So he led that attack that day. The fellow on the right is Merv Hall, who won the Distinguished Conduct Medal. He was also wounded in the attack. He's been helped back. So these were two of the guys, originals. Both, one was a platoon sergeant, the other section leader. And these were the type of guys who were basically the glue that held any unit together. You can look at any unit in any army, and it's held together by these senior NCOs, the sergeants and the corporals. And you can go back to any war in any decade, in any era. It's the same. These are the guys. If you've got guys like this, crackerjack soldiers like this with who know their stuff, they're the ones who'll take the unit through.
Because if I'm following this correctly, I mean, I have read the book. I mean, we're given the naval, the artillery bombardment, given the fact the Kitty Hawks have been dumping all their stuff on it as well, and given the fact the Japanese pretty much know which way any Australian attack would be coming from. There's no, this isn't where an officer can pull out some kind of particular maneuver from the Sandhurst manual of something. This is about sheer just blood and guts and determination and working up a path, and just it's aggression and fighting spirit more than tactical prowess, isn't it? Really, I mean, I'm not saying they haven't got tactical prowess. I'm saying this is a very basic infantryman, just heads down, keep on going. I mean, and when you talk to the veterans as you did for this, that's obviously what they're conveying to you. It was kind of just keep on going.
I talked to this guy on the left. I talked to Tom McMahon only a couple of months before he died. He was in hospital, and I talked to him on the phone, and he'd never talked about this before, really, this battle. And he started just as if he was still there, because he was out on his own for a while. And he was just saying, why don't they come and help me? And they couldn't get up the slope. He got up quickly, but they couldn't. And they finally came in and helped him. But it was as if I'd taken him back to another time. And you could hear it in his voice. It's just incredible. And I think if I take away anything from writing these books, it's the experience of meeting these guys and understanding what they went through. And I think you're the same if you talk to D-Day vets and people like that. It's the same. You don't understand it unless you talk to them.
Absolutely. And it's sad to think that we talked about with Robert Lyman yesterday and other historians, that the next generation of historians will have much more in the way of digital archives. They'll have communication at ultra speed around the world, contact fellow and historians and authors. But what they can't go back in time is just spend time kind of in a pub with these guys and chatting to them on the telephone and in an environment where you can just convey their stories. Not that we rely solely on their oral testimonies, because as we know, they can get flawed and memories can get confused, but it's just the spending time with them gives you the respect to then take forward that, to then create some kind of everlasting version of the battle in terms of a book, and that's what you've clearly done there. So again, there's that it looks like that's a fake photo, that, because the steepness of the ridge there is just insane.
It's that steep. That's the Pimple, which was the first objective, and that's after they captured it. And in fact, they had to cut. You'll see in the next photo, which is a modern photo, you'll see how they've cut a track in the side. You see the left-hand side of the Pimple's been cut away, and that's it. There, up the top. Further right. That's it, right there.
Right. Yeah.
So they've cut that in half, so they could get around it, because it was just too steep on the sides. They also had positions down the sides in little bunkers down the sides of the hill as well, which proved very difficult to knock out.
So, I mean, I'm hoping everyone who's watching this and who are watching it later are going to go out and order the book. But for those who aren't familiar with it yet, I mean, with a trail like this, it's not like you can put all your strength in one go, because you can't advance on a broad front. It's going to have to be kind of a narrow front there. So how many men are actually kind of pushing up there, and how long did it take to get up to the Pimple?
This was one platoon. You couldn't put more than a platoon in. Even a platoon was a lot of men. So one platoon took, one of the platoon, 10 platoon took the pimple and then moved on. Then they had some wounded further up. So then another platoon came up and leapfrogged them. And then a third platoon. So they had 3 platoons up there. And then that company was relieved the next day by a second company. But you could only put a company up there at a time, and they were spread out along about 100 meters of ridge. So that's a good shot of further along the ridge. This was actually taken later in the campaign, but shows very well where the Australian, the next day where they attacked, they actually climbed down the ridge and moved around and then came up the side of the ridge. They lifted a guy up on someone's shoulders so he could use his own gun to fire into a bunker and throw a grenade into it. Incredible athleticism and, you know, devotion to duty, if you like. But that's what it took to capture these positions. And so that was the as far as the 2nd 16th took the position. And then Japanese opened up with mountain guns, and they had to pull back a bit because they started losing casualties to tree bursts.
Wow. And what sort of losses are we talking about? You said 10 platoon, you know, were the ones to fight up the pimple there.
Yeah,
you said they're dealing with malaria as well.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, yeah, in the attack they lost about 2nd 16th. They lost about a dozen men and probably another 20 wounded, which doesn't sound a lot, but you know, all losses are serious. But as I said, the malaria, everyone got it at some stage. So usually 5%, which is about I don't know, about 500 men were out of action at any time.
Wow. And they're the same view there, but pretty much, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the same view. So that's the view today, or back in 1990s. And you can see there it hasn't changed. And it just shows you it's still open on that side, because that side, the rain all goes on the other side. So but you can just see the challenge it is to actually, they sent guys down you know, halfway down the mountain, and then they walked along and then came up behind the Japanese lines, directed into position by guys with walkie-talkies further back, saying right under the Japanese position now, because they would have no way of knowing looking up as they climbed up the ridge. But just to do that, and you know, grenades dropping on them, all sorts of things, just extraordinary, you know, bravery and just ability, you know, flexibility, ability to execute. So this is an aerial view from the side of the ridge, and that same position we talked about. You can see there, green sniper's pimple, and McCorkey's Knoll was the final position they took. It's named after a lieutenant who was a platoon commander who was killed. He was killed at that position by the Japanese mountain gun, which is one of the reasons then they pulled back further back along the ridge to the pimple after the attack.
Wow. And this is, I'm thinking now that, you know, as we're getting towards, you know, 44 and 45, this is, the Allied push through the Pacific is we're gaining the upper hand now. We've got the logistical support. We've got massive, great fleets out there. The British, Australian, American fleets out there. Our units are getting better and better and better, and we're winning the war on that large level. And yet, like with all wars, like with Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, it still comes down to boots on ground. And until you've cleared an enemy from that dominating bit of high ground like Shaggy Ridge, doesn't matter how many aircraft you've got in the sky. You said about air superiority, you said about this, but until some poor sods have climbed up that ridge under fire with grenades rolling down and actually taken and dislodged that enemy, even if there's, as you say, one man there, that one man, I mean, it's a one man metaphorically, is a huge threat. And this is this ongoing thing about combat is, like, even today, it doesn't matter how many billion-dollar stealth jets you have flying in the air, some poor infantryman with a backpack on his shoulders has to actually take the ground and clear them of the enemy. And this is what, to me, the Shaggy Ridge battle is all about, is that some poor guy just having to move up a horrible bit of terrain against an incredibly well-dug enemy and make sure that enemy is removed.
True, yeah.
So here, another aerial photo there.
Yeah, so this is at this time the 21st Brigade and the 25th Brigade, which are the two brigades that have been up there since September, were both relieved. They were relieved by the 18th Brigade and the 15th Brigade. And it was the 18th Brigade which now was given the job of actually taking the ridge. So 3 battalions. So they did a total brigade attack. They had 1 battalion moving along the ridge, 1 around one side and 1 around the other. And this is a view taken at that time, just before that final attack.
And Ernest Manny is saying, we might do a question for you now, Philip, is that there were a number of British officers from Burma on loan to the AIF at this point of the battle, and some died there. Is that something you want to elaborate on?
Yeah, there was about 24 officers came up. They were sent over from Burma to learn how to fight in the jungle, and they were attached to units. They were told not to go into battle, but a number of them found themselves in the battle, and one guy, Captain Stanton, was killed on the ridge, further up the ridge during the battle. He's buried in Leigh Cemetery. He's actually had won there's an award at Sandhurst College for the top cadet, and he was awarded that. And then before he was commissioned, and he came here and was killed in this battle, never got to Burma. And there was a couple of others who were wounded. But some of the stories, you can read it in a book about them, that English officers directing Australian troops who it wasn't going to work unless they led from the front, because the Australians, that's how they operated, their officers operated. They were expected to take the same risks as their men. And a number of forces are similar. US Marines operate in a similar way. And so these guys took it on, and they were very brave, and but they were, they were killed or wounded because of it, yeah. Mm. But those officers went back to Burma and were very useful in, developing tactics during the fighting in Burma in 44 and 45, in leading, they would lead companies over there and become very effective. As you know, in the British became very effective, the 14th Army became very effective in those later campaigns.
Well, so I think that's one of Robert Lyman's main points there. Is
Robert's
they came back in 44 was nothing like the army that had been pushed out 2 years earlier. They came back with new tactics, new approaches. Everything was better. The kit was better. The dealing with the conditions was better. And the Allies, even when they're losing campaigns earlier in the war, come back from them bigger and stronger. Whereas it has to be said, the Japanese and the Germans sometimes aren't able to improve their tactics as the war goes on. The Japanese are good at one thing, but they're not really good at developing more things as the war goes on. Whereas the Allies kind of end up outdoing them at their own game, outplaying them at their own game, essentially.
Yeah, it's a good example. We often hear of that the Allies did their own things. The Americans and British and Australians did their own things, and that. But actually, there were very good examples, and that was one of them. Was where they cooperated and cross-generated the ideas, and that particularly there was one commando captain I knew very well who was in the independent companies operating behind Japanese lines, and he ended up going to Burma as a battalion commander. They took him because he had so much experience and passed that on to the men under him. Yeah. So this is the attack, what they call Operation Cutthroat, which is the attack to take Shaggy Ridge. So Shaggy Ridge is in the middle there. On the left, you have a battalion advancing up the valley. They went around the back of the Japanese. That's it, the 2nd 12th Battalion, and they went up to what's called Prothero at the northern end of the ridge. The 2nd 9th Battalion attacked straight along the ridge. They're in the middle. So they attacked along the ridge after the 2nd 12th went up, got behind the Japanese. And the 2nd 10th Battalion on the right-hand flank, they were basically operating in a diversionary role to hold Japanese forces in that area while the main attack went in along Shaggy Ridge. So we'll talk a little bit now and show some photos from the 2nd 12th Battalion advance along that river. That was really rough country, getting along that river and then getting up to the Japanese. So this is up on Mount Prothero, and this is a Japanese gun position, which had been causing so much trouble to the Australians further along Shaggy Ridge. They couldn't find this position. You can see why, how well camouflaged it is. And it was right on the edge of the ridge, firing directly along the ridge. Now, when the Australians came up, they came up to this gun position from behind, but didn't even know it was there. The first thing they knew that it was there was that the 75 millimeter mountain gun was in that bunker, and they turned it around and they fired out the back, and there were over 50 Australian casualties from that gun before they knocked it out. So it just shows the effectiveness of the Japanese could be, under the conditions, but nonetheless, they'd let the Australians up on the ridge for the sake of probably a section of men who could have held the ridge at that point. They just didn't have the men to do it, and they somehow didn't hear the Australians coming. So these are some of the 2nd 12th Battalion guys up on the ridge outside the bunker at that time. Yeah, the day after it was taken. And that's on the left is a diagram of the bunker, which was drawn after the event. You can see how it's sort of basically buried underground. Somehow they turned that gun around, and that on the right is a 75mm Type 94 Japanese mountain gun, which is it can be dismantled into pieces and carried separately. And having such a weapon up there was extremely effective for the Japanese, gave them a real benefit, and obviously caused a lot of casualties to the Australians when it's fired out of that back door you can see in the diagram. They couldn't fire very accurately, but they could fire it up into the trees, and the shrapnel from the blasts just rained down on the Australians and caused a lot of casualties. Amongst them, the battalion commander, he was wounded. And that's one of the stretchers up there. I talked to one of the stretcher bearers who worked up there, wrote a diary, and his diary features in the book. Fascinating about the situation up there. So what they would do, they would build stretchers from the bush. So they would cut down the saplings you can see there. They made them long enough because at times you needed 8 men to carry a stretcher down those slopes. At times even 16 men, because you had to hand it from 8 men to 8 men. So they had to build these stretchers. So what they would do, they would build them with twine. In the end, they ran out of twine. They used signal cable to tie them, and then they had blankets or half blankets which they put for the men to lie in, and they had them so they could lie in them but sink down, not like a normal stretcher where you lie on the stretcher. In this case, they lay in the stretcher because otherwise they would just fall off because of the slopes. And so that's how they carried out the men who had to be carried out. And I talked to one guy. He had a shell fragment passed between his knees. Basically, his knees he was cut off at the knees. He was lucky to live, obviously, but he did live, and he lived mainly because the men got him out to the casualty clearing station further down off the ridge. So here's this is taken in a casualty clearing station. The guy on the right is Colonel Bourne, who was the battalion commander who was wounded by the mountain gun, lucky to live. He had a large piece of shell penetrate his stomach. And the guy on the left is Corporal Scholik, one of the other men who was wounded. But they set up this dressing station, and they carried out, there were 58 casualties came into that dressing station. There was only one surgeon there, and he carried out 41 operations. They never lost a life of anyone who came into that dressing station. Just extraordinary. Though we talk about frontline battles, but here's a guy fighting in the front line with his scalpel, and he would sleep for 2 hours a day at that time. That's all. The rest of the time he was operating on men, and just an incredible story. And I had this guy's diary. I had the story, the whole story. So, plus he took the photographs. He had a camera with him, which is very rare in New Guinea for soldiers to have cameras. So I was lucky enough to have access to these photographs as well. So now we'll go to the 2nd 9th Battalion, who would make the attack along the ridge. At this stage, they were living basically in shelters that were constructed on the side of the ridge. You can see how steep the ridge is. So they had to sort of construct these shelters out from the side of the ridge and stick tents on them. So like platforms. Quite extraordinary, but it gives you an idea of how steep the country was up there.
Crazy stuff.
There's another photo. This is taken down the side of the Pimple, and you can see there, that's the kitchen, and they've cut into the side of the ridge like a track, like what they call a bench cut track. So it's cut like a bench into the side of the ridge, and that's how they would travel along. And you can see tents down on the side of the ridge there that the men were sleeping in. So it was quite extraordinary conditions. And this is actually, so as I say, on the side of Shaggy Ridge. This is a picture of, this is another of the iconic pictures that they used to have a blow up of the photo on the left in the Australian War Memorial when I was a kid. And I remember going down there and looking at that photograph and thinking, how on earth could you fight a battle there? And so it was one of the reason photos that took me back to Shaggy Ridge. And as you can see, I went to the same spot many years later. So to take this position, again, the Australians, they moved down the side of the ridge and then walked along and then climbed the ridge to attack. And one of the highlights of writing this book was the chance to use an account written by a guy called Sergeant Sean O'Leary, who took part in that attack. And I'll just quote a couple of his his points. He talked about the ridge. The ridge falls away in sheer declivities, and that's him describing the ridge. In places, the top is only a few inches wide. You've got to climb where there are no holes, and the slopes fall away like a leaning wall. And I think that's a good description of it. It's like a leaning wall that you're trying to climb up. The climbing is worse than the firing. So they were getting fired at it, and grenades were rolled down on them as they attacked. But the climbing was the worst. You remember they've got packs on their back. They're carrying their rifles. Unbelievable terrain to be fighting in. So they're saying you hold one side of the pimple, and the Japs hold the other. That's what he said. And then the mountain guns firing along the ridge, and the company commander of that attack, A Company, Major Loxton, he was killed by the blast from the mountain gun during that attack. And so at the end of his description, he said, "You'll remember everything that happened this day. You'll never forget Shaggy Ridge." And that to me said a lot about the place. And anyone who fought up there, and I talked to a lot of guys who did, they'd always say, "Well, we never forget Shaggy Ridge. How could you?" So that's sort of how I'd like to sort of end my talk about it. Just basically the follow-up to that was they moved along the ridge and met up with the guys at the other end, the 2nd 12th Battalion, and they took the ridge. Then they pushed through to Madang over the next few months. Meanwhile, the Americans had landed on the north side of the area, and then the Americans pushed on to Hollandia later, but that battle was over. But it was one of many battles, but as I say, quite a unique battle in the Second World War. I can't think of any other battle that really equates to it in terms of the terrain it was fought over.
Well, I mean, my takeaways are, one is the terrain speaks for itself. I mean, nearly all the conversation in the sidebar today have been, "Oh my God, the terrain, look at that ridge. Oh my God, imagine fighting a battle there." And that's the ability to convey that via YouTube with color photos is amazing, that we can bring this battlefield to people watching around the world. The second thing is
Yep.
that in the grand scheme of things, when you're talking about the Pacific campaign, we tend to just focus on those big chapters, the Iwo Jimas, the Pelelius, and the Kohima Imphaals in Burma and things like that. And there are these, and I'm not using the word lesser battle in any sense, but there are these lesser known battles that are absolutely important. And one of the things I'm going to suggest that the viewers do is just search Shaggy Ridge on YouTube, and you'll find out that Australian forces still go there for training. They still go there to understand terrain, to understand holding positions, but also in a kind of pilgrimage kind of sense as well. It means a lot to Australian infantry. The legend of this battle obviously endures and carries on, and it's, people sometimes, I was a question earlier on about how many casualties were incurred, and sometimes it's not about casualties, and it's not about how many men were lost taking a place, because in some ways the casualties were relatively light. They could have been a lot worse. What matters is that this battle had to happen. It did dislodge these Japanese, and it's part of our understanding of the Pacific campaign, and therefore it's important. But we've talked about what that aspect of it being a legendary battle from the Australian point of view. But these three Japanese accounts you use in the book, how did they perceive this? I mean, what was their perception? Was it an honourable defeat? Did they say anything about the Australian attackers and give them any kind of praise for their endurance?
Oh yeah, I mean, the Japanese had a different perspective on it because of the difficulties they had. So they're talking a lot about, for example, food. I was just reading a Japanese account today, a summary of the Pacific War that had been translated, and just the amount of troops in Japan who died of starvation fighting for Japan because they couldn't get supplies. So starvation, so food was always an issue. I mean, food was an issue, just getting supplies, ammunition, this type of thing. Medical treatment was a big issue up there. They had nothing like the medical treatment that the Allied troops could get. The Allied troops could be evacuated that same day, flown back out to Port Moresby and back to Australia if necessary. So there's a lot of aspects of Japanese. One of the Japanese accounts that fascinated me was this account of three men who did a night raid on the Australian positions, and they were armed. Two were armed with sharpened bamboo sticks, and one was armed with a sword, because they had to travel light. So they attacked at night. They found an Australian outpost position and attacked them with bamboos. But before they did that, they found Australians had left their food and gone to bed, under their mosquito nets. So they ate their food first, and then they attacked them with bamboo spears and a sword, and caused a hell of a ruckus. These guys weren't killed, but they were wounded, and then they ran off. Anyway, the next day, General Vasey, who was in charge of the 7th Division, in charge up there, he'd contacted his superior back in New Guinea Force Headquarters and said, I need an extra brigade. I need another 3 battalions up here. We're getting attacked at night. And there was 3 guys who caused this. So to match those accounts up together, I found really interesting. And just to see how the perspective from the Australian point of view, the perspective from the Japanese point of view. And when you've got those sort of things match up, it's really special in terms of when you're writing an account about a battle to get both sides of the story. And both sides of the story are very different.
Well, absolutely. And we've got one. Ernest Malley is jumping in again. He says, one more thing for Philip. Perhaps he could mention the American volunteer Tommy Roberts. It's such a great little story from the battle that perhaps the audience would enjoy.
Yeah, Tommy Roberts was an American pilot. And he's an American reconnaissance pilot flying in New Guinea. He had been a hunter pre-war. So he'd been out in Colorado as a hunter guide. And one of the guys he guided was a American colonel called Colonel Hutchinson, who actually commanded the reconnaissance aircraft unit that he later got into because he made his way into it because he knew Hutchinson. So Hutchinson, so Robert said, I want to go and fight in the front line, and this was unheard of for an American pilot to take leave and go and fight with Australians. But Hutchinson approached General Vasey and said, look, I've got this guy who wants to do this. And Vasey thought, because this was at a time there was a lot of animosity between the Americans and Australians, particularly after what had happened in the Buna battles and San Fernando, where the Australians had to come in and basically save the American arse to a degree. Americans might disagree with that.
I have no problem you saying that. Yeah.
Yeah. No. It was again acting as allies. The Australians were much more experienced in this type of fighting, so they were able to do the hard yards at Buna, which the Americans found very difficult, particularly after being there long and losing men through malaria and such. So to make a good story from America, Australia, Vasey probably saw this. So he let him go up there to fight. So he fought with the 2nd 16th Battalion at the Pimple. And Tommy Roberts happened to be with that platoon that went in and took the Pimple. So he was up there with his American hunting rifle and his flying boots on and firing at the Japanese. He reckons he got a few, I don't know. But he was there. Yeah, he was in the front line. And later on, I met his brother. He went missing later. His body's never been found. He went missing in an aircraft accident soon after that. But I met his brother over in California and had lunch with him. And he showed me his hunting rifles and his M1 Garand from the war. And got to talk to him about it. So yeah, it's a great story, and it's in the book. So it's quite it's a neat little story.
It is, certainly is. And so, what are you working on right now? What's the next project?
I'm actually going back to. I've always had a little itch I wanted to scratch with a World War I battle called the Battle for Bullecourt, which took place in France in 1917. So I've always wanted to write up that. I've got a lot of accounts from that battle which I wanted to put together. So that's a big task, but that's a project. But I'll probably go back to New Guinea at some stage and write another book about New Guinea. I've written 8 books about New Guinea, and so yeah, but I just take a break from it for the moment.
Well, we'll definitely want you can come back and do something with us in Australia Week. And we were saying before we went live about the resurgence of interest finally for Australians in the Pacific theatre and the Far East, and even for the Americans. John McManus, who was on the Buna show. I mean, his book about the American Army in the Pacific is the Marines have kind of overshadowed everything for years and years. And there've always been lots of books about the Pacific, but like with the ETO, it's been the same battles talked about again and again and again, and the spotlight hasn't gone out very widely to these other battles. And it's important to understand that the broad picture, and New Guinea is a fascinating campaign. I can understand why 8 books is only still scratching the surface of it, really. It's so many. There's a defensive
when I do my next talk was on my book before this called D-Day New Guinea, about the Battle for Lae, And that's very much an American-Australian operation, because the Americans provided all the amphibious landing force. And they also provided a regiment of paratroopers which landed west of Lae to help capture and they were carried by, obviously, by American transport planes. So it also talks about the battle, the American airfield engineers, which built airfields out in the middle of nowhere so they could attack Wewak and knock out Japanese air strength at Wewak before they attacked Lae, which is really a prerequisite. It was a bit like, there's a lot of similarities to Operation Overlord, actually, in France, because it was an amphibious and an airborne operation at the same time. And at this stage, this took place in September 1943, so it was after Sicily. And Sicily, as you know, was a total disaster for airborne troops. And Eisenhower was thinking of dropping them from the D-Day plan. He said, well, why would we have them if this is going to happen? The landing at Lae took place at the time they were discussing this, and it was a perfect landing. It took place in daylight, a smoke screen. Admittedly, there were very few defenders, but they all landed perfectly and proved it could be done. They did in daylight, unlike at night in Normandy. But so that's why I call the book D-Day New Guinea, because of these similarities with an airborne and an amphibious landing. Yeah.
Well, we look forward to that one there, and I think my last closing point is, of course, is that it would be great if in the future we can look at these Australian, American, and indeed British battles collectively, as opposed to what's been happening for years. As Americans write about the American bit for the American audience, Aussies write about the Australian bit for the Aussie audience, and Brits write about the British bit for the British audience. And it's actually connecting them together and connecting these threads, because as we talked about Robert Lyman, the eventual cooperation between the various forces out there was part of the success eventually. Is that sure, there's the ribbing and the rivalry and the Aussies calling us the Poms and the Americans being the jokes, but eventually this cooperation between these forces was to have a huge impact on this area, particularly not again, because of the fame of things like Peleliu and Iwo Jima, which were mostly American only. We forget that there were these other campaigns, the New Guinea campaign, which were multinational, and Burma, of course, as Robert Lyman said last night, less than 10% of the troops in the 14th Army were white. There were as many West African division personnel out in Burma as there were white men from Britain. It's incredible.
And Indians,
Indian so, well, there we are. Well, I'll just remind people what we've got coming up, and I'll come back and say goodbye in a second. So that was a lovely show, folks. I really enjoyed that. And so we've got a little bit of a gap for me now to get over my last bits of my cold. I'm doing some filming tomorrow and Thursday with JD Hewitt from the History Underground site, YouTube channel. So eventually there'll be some stuff where I'm on his channel as he's been on my channel. And Friday, as I said at the beginning of the show, Daniel Burke is coming on to talk about his grandfather in Burma. But right now, it remains me to say thank you very much, Phillip Bradley, for joining us, and you come back and talk about the D-Day in New Guinea in November. Yep. And for those who are watching, it's been really good and informative, and I hope you'll all go away and have a bit of an understanding about this little-known battle in terms of the Americans and Brits watching this. I mean, Darren Little is watching it, Philip, and Darren's grandfather and uncle out in Burma didn't know much about this battle, and that's the point. You can get people who are very well read about the Far East, but none of us know everything, and it's important to cover it. So there we are. We'll both hold up our books there. How about that? That's a good shot.
There you go.
Right. So thanks everybody.
Thanks very much.
For World War II TV saying I will see you all again on Friday. Enjoy your break from me, as I will enjoy my break from presenting and getting over my cold. Thanks everybody. See ya.